as the Earth turns on its axis away from the bright, warm center of our solar system towards the vastness of space. We reach a point called the Midnight Nexus. It is where transmissions from the dark void of our universe are most easily intercepted. These transmissions seem to be coming from different worlds, alternate realities, and even the past and the future. Dark secrets and otherworldly tales have been pieced together and are presented to you here. Welcome to the Midnight Nexus.
When all the scary creatures come out to prowl through every neighborhood. But here's the scariest monster of all. Do you know why? This little witch doesn't.
Bugs by B.D. Yates. Jamie Nielsen watched in horror as the mosquito lighted on his arm, its tiny, whining body barely visible in the fading afternoon light. He cringed at the feel of it slipping between the scant hairs of his forearm, telling himself that there were only seconds before he felt the itching stab of the bite. But he didn't dare slap it. Jamie was repulsed by bugs. All bugs, even cute little ladybugs and gentle hovering fireflies. It was their legs, all those writhing, wriggling legs, flailing antennae. It was their black, shining, unblinking eyes. It was their slimy, cheese-curd eggs laid in the tangles of your hair or deep in the well of your ear as you slept soundlessly. It was their twitching and ratcheting wings. It was the diseases they carried most of all. AIDS, West Nile virus, Zika, chikungunya, malaria. Jamie knew that the mosquito was more likely to kill you than the great white shark. Once the mosquito was on you, you never wanted to slap it. Never. Then you were apt to have someone else's blood splatter onto your bare skin. You had to act fast and brush it off. But that meant you had to touch it, even with the briefest of hand swipes. And Jamie didn't want to do that either. He was paralyzed with fear and simply didn't have time to be. Jamie clawed at the lower right pocket of his muddy cargo shorts and ripped out his trusty can of bug spray. It was his talisman. He carried the bug spray like pretty girls carried mace, though clearly it didn't work as well as advertised once you worked up a sweat. The mosquito hadn't bitten him yet. There was still time. He placed his pointer finger on the plastic button, pointed the nozzle at his arm, then slap! Jamie blinked, trying to register what just happened. The mosquito on his arm had been replaced by the pale and freckled hand of Gage Hollis, his best friend in the whole world, though he often wondered why he was his best friend. And Gage was a perpetually good-natured bully. When the hand came away, there was nothing left but a greasy black smudge across a shining blob of someone else's poisoned blood. Why? Jamie demanded, his voice breaking and echoing through the towering playground equipment. Why would you slap it? Gage smirked and wrinkled his thin beak of a nose, wiping the mess of blood and guts on his palm across the expensive Green Bay Packers jersey he always wore on the weekends. The boxy white number 8 now bore a pink stain that made Jamie want to puke. Jamie didn't puke, but he did gag. There was no stopping it. He snatched up a wad of crabgrass and used it as a makeshift napkin, scrubbing his arm raw as Gage threw his head back and laughed. "It's probably your blood, numbnuts," he sneered. "You hadn't bitten me yet, you retard," Jamie snapped back, his eyes and nostrils streaming. "Why are you such a pussy? Why are you such a fucking queer?" That got them both laughing. And though he was revolted, Jamie relished the tingle of excitement that trickled through his chest and stomach every time he swore. Not only had he called Gage a queer, which was bad enough, but he called him a fucking queer. That took it to a whole new level of bad. That strapped a bomb to it and made it explode. At the ripe old age of 13, he finally understood why adults like to cuss so much, and he did it every chance he got. Never around his mom and dad, of course. He fancied himself a bit of a bad boy, but enough to say fuck and shit, and even the dreaded cunt. But he didn't want his Xbox taken away. Fuck that shit. "It's just a stupid bug," Gage said, extending his tongue and pretending to lick the guts off the palm of his hand. Jamie gagged again and shoved Gage as hard as he could, which wasn't very hard at all. "Why are you licking it? It's not a wiener." Their combined laughter tittered across the abandoned playground, and in the purple glow of the approaching twilight, Jamie found the echoes just a little bit spooky. He couldn't let Gage know that, though. He already thought he was a pussy because bugs gave him the heebie-jeebies. "I know. You're too pussy to go into the Hollerin' house," Gage said ominously. "Nobody goes in there. I did once, but everyone else is too chicken shit." It was Jamie's turn to mock. "The door and windows are boarded up, you dumb shit. You didn't go in there." "I did too," said Gage, smiling, as if he were letting Jamie in on a deliciously dirty secret. "There's a board missing over there, right by the living room window. You can squeeze right in. There's no glass or anything left. Honest Injun." He placed his hand over his heart like he was swearing an oath, flipping a lock of sweaty red hair from his forehead with a casual jerk of his neck. "Are you too pussy to prove it?" Jamie hissed. Then he felt the cold cocktail of dread mixed with regret tickling into his guts. "I really opened a can of worms with that one," he thought morosely, unaware that he was using a metaphor his dad always used. A disgusting metaphor. "Nope," Gage said, puffing out his chest. He slapped another mosquito off the back of his neck and peered down at the bloody goop in his palm. Jamie felt his stomach clench, then coated himself with a cold, pungent bug spray. "We can go right now." Jamie suddenly felt like he needed to drop a deuce, but there was another stirring in his abdomen that was more incessant. It was pride. Foolish, childish pride. Just this once, he would not let fear control him. Just this one time, he would not back down. Then, maybe Gage would ease off him a little. Jamie jogged over to where their bikes lay, tangled together in a snarl of aluminum and brake cables. He swung his leg over, and he was pedaling before Gage even processed what was happening. No words needed to be said. Both boys knew the way, as all boys seemed to know the way to their local haunted house. Dad had told him that it wasn't supposed to rain all over the weekend, and that was a real can of worms because his tomato plants were barely hanging on by a thread. But Jamie's eyes kept drifting up to the bruise-colored sky. The moon was full, and that was good because neither of them had flashlights, and neither of their simple emergencies only cell phones were equipped with one. The moon was bright, but the fluffy black clouds kept drifting over the silvery disk as though the sky was winking at them. Their bike tires hummed through the long pools of shadow it cast across the pavement like spectral lava. The tattered playing card Gage had clothespin to his rear tire clattered like a nightmare machine gun. "He killed his wife and kids with a blowtorch, you know," Gage called over his shoulder with a devious grin. "Old man hollered. He took it into their rooms, one by one, and put the nozzle or whatever in their mouths. He roasted them from the inside out. No, he chopped them with an axe," Jamie yelled back, flinching with his own callousness. "Everyone knows that. If he did it with the blowtorch, he'd have burned his damn house down. The whole place." "It is burnt down," Gage said matter-of-factly. Jamie's heart skipped a beat as he realized that, for once, his friend was right. He had seen the Holleran house only once or twice before, but he could still remember the black tentacles of soot spreading out from the empty windows and snaking across the peeling walls. He wasn't sure he had heard the axe story. It seemed like everyone knew what really happened to the Hollerans, and everyone was an expert. Jamie tried to imagine what it would feel like, what it would taste like, to have lit the blowtorch and stuffed it into his mouth. It made his stomach heave and roll against his ribs. And again he decided he would prefer the axe to that kind of torture. Somewhere in the corridors of his young mind where the nightmare creatures that slithered and stalked and kept him awake at night reside, he could hear the fluttering sound of caution tape the police had wrapped around the gnarled banisters of the front porch like a neon yellow spider web. He was not eager to return there, but the waving grass on either side of the street was already becoming patchy and yellow, forgotten. They were getting close. The Holleran house always seemed to creep up on you. You tried to prepare yourself for it, and it always seemed like you had plenty of time to prepare, and then it was suddenly just there. It happened that way again tonight. The sight of the dilapidated old house looming out of the darkness frightened Jamie so badly that he nearly flipped his bike. He wanted to turn tail and run. He wanted to speed home as fast as his legs could pedal. He wanted to do math homework and play Grand Theft Auto. He wanted to do anything but visit this old place, this old mausoleum. And he hated himself for being the one to suggest this little field trip in the first place. His legs did not obey him, however. He was numb as he followed Gage up into the front porch, ducking under faded caution tape. The slippery planks of the porch squealed in protest as they approached an open window to the right of the barricaded front door. Jamie swallowed with an audible click as he stared into a well of darkness inside. Again, Gage hadn't been lying. "There's no glass," Gage repeated, his voice oddly steady. "Just throw your leg over." Jamie did as he was told, and before he could utter any protest, he was standing in the ruined living room of the Holleran house. Everything smelled of wet leaves and mildew, a pungent hint of old smoke and charred wood. It was mostly empty, save for an old coffee table that leaned on two legs and what appeared to be the lumpy shape of a sofa with a stiffened sheet draped over it. The breeze outside whistled through the boards and the holes in the roof, producing a moan that made the house appear to be breathing. Jamie's teeth began to chatter. "Why use fire?" Jamie croaked, his throat completely devoid of any moisture. Gage dug into his back pocket and removed a small object. Jamie heard the familiar snick of a lighter. "Wouldn't it just be easier to use, like, a shotgun or something?" Gage said nothing. The tiny flicker of the flame cast an orange shadow across his face. "Where'd you get that?" Jamie asked innocently. As he was still young enough to be awed by something as exotic as a lighter. He was just jealous that Gage actually carried one. It was such a badass thing to do. It was my mom's." "I want to show you something really scary, though. I think it's why he used fire." Gage took Jamie by the wrist and led him across the dead living room. Jamie did his best to block out thoughts of what might be living inside the walls. If not for the moan and sigh of the wind through the house, he probably would have been able to hear the skittering and scuttering of a million tiny legs. "Stop it, Jamie, don't be a pussy," he thought to himself. Gage stopped at the rear wall, lifting the lighter up to shine the firelight on what Jamie had thought was just another oddly shaped soot stain. "Look at that shit," Gage whispered, and Jamie felt his hair stand on end. His bladder threatened to let go if he dropped his guard for a single moment. Above the yawning mouth of the old fireplace, someone, probably crazy old man Holleran, had painted an upside-down cross on the wall. It wasn't an ordinary cross by any stretch of the imagination. On the ends of each cross's forearms, Holleran had painted the head of an insect, heads complete with pincers and antennae. Spider-like legs had been added to the intersection of the cross, giving it the look of some sort of mutated alien bug. Scrawled above the insect's cross were the words, "He sent among them swarms of flies that devoured them." Beneath the cross were the words, "Cleanse the swarm with fire." "I think it's painted in blood," Gage said, reaching out to touch the lumpy surface of the cross. As the pad of his fingers contacted with the substance, his entire body became rigid, as if a piece of wood. Jamie stared slack-jawed, waiting for him to move or make a sound. Gage?" he whispered tentatively. It still sounded very loud in the living room, the stillness. "You okay?" Gage was still frozen, but he was making a sound now. It was a thick, throaty sound, like he was trying to swallow a giant wad of snot. Jamie could see the sides of his neck pulsating, but his fingers stayed glued to the upside-down cross. "Gage! Gage!" Gage turned his freckled, pale face, twisted with confusion, and looked at Jamie. He looked like he'd never heard his own name before. His throat clicked and throbbed, thin lips quivering. "Gage, are you... Suddenly Gage began to gag. Violent retches that arched his spine into a scorpion tail. With every heave, Jamie lunged forward in pure instinct. His friend was choking to death right in front of him. He had to do something, anything. He began to slam the palm of his hand into Gage's back again and again, trying to dislodge whatever was killing him. But the skin under his shirt felt wrong. It felt like there were thousands of small hard objects under the cloth. Objects that were moving and wriggling, popping like zits under his hand. "We are many," Gage bubbled in a voice that was much too deep to be his own. He pivoted upright, swaying drunkenly, then vomited with the force of a fire hose. What issued from the boy's open mouth aged Jamie 10 years in a single second. Yellowish foam sprayed from Gage's head, foam that was clotted with tangles of wriggling worms and flailing centipedes. They slithered down over his chin and plopped into an ever-widening puddle between his shoes. Clouds of winged insects began to buzz out of Gage's throat and nostrils. Flies, bees, mosquitoes, wasps. They formed a halo around the staggering boy, like miniature vultures, as he continued spewing his living vomit. Vomit that was congealing into glistening tentacles that had already swallowed his feet and were beginning to consume his legs like hungry, wandering vines. "Gage, what the hell is happening?" Jamie blubbered, backing away from the thing that had once been his friend. Gage tried to speak, but it didn't sound like words. It sounded like thick mud boiling in a coffee pot. The boy's eyes ruptured into glistening maggot pits, his left ear detaching and tumbling down onto the carpet of bugs that covered his chest and shoulders. One of Gage's arms thudded heavily to the floor, the exposed bone startling white, clean among the swarms of insects that moved hurriedly. Take two. One of Gage's arms thudded heavily to the floor, the exposed bone startling white, clean among the swarms of insects that moved hurriedly to claim it. Two hairy mandibles unfurled from Gage's gaping mouth, twitching and rubbing together with a grotesque rasping sound. The boy looked bigger, somehow, bulkier, taller. He looked like his body had become nothing more than a shell. It was a chrysalis, ripping apart so whatever had infested him could be born. With wet, plodding sounds, the boy insect thing began to walk and stalk toward Jamie. "We are many," he crooned, even as Gage's jaw fell off. "Swarm with us, child, and forsake your false prophet." Jamie was like a gunslinger, paralyzed and yet somehow motivated by his crippling fear at the same time. He clawed his pocket, feeling for that reassuring bulge of bug spray. Gage was nothing more than a pile of crimson tatters now. In his place was a humanoid mass of legs and wings and antennae. The powering brute looked like TV static in the shape of a giant lumbering monster. Bloated earthworms and pus-yellow tapeworms wrapped around each other to form grasping fingers, fingers that inched closer to Jamie's pallid face. "Swarm, child. Swarm with us, runt!" "Fuck you," Jamie screamed, drawing the bug spray like a trusty cattleman revolver and mashing the button down until the knuckles of his right hand cracked. The can hissed, filling the moldy air, the monster's infirm face with noxious chemicals. The thing shrieked loud enough to burst eardrums, but Jamie ignored his impulse to clap his hands over his ears. Instead, he did the unimaginable. He stepped toward the thing, keeping the button pressed even as he felt his fingertips go numb. The bug creature roared and flailed, fragmenting, losing cohesion. It tried to form its limbs again, but Jamie would not give in, not a single inch. He sprayed until the can was empty, and then he launched it into the quivering mound of dying insects as hard as he could. He wanted to throw himself into the swarm and stomp and jump and grind his shoes into what was left of the creature that had killed his best friend. But there was no time. The surviving bugs were already pulling themselves together again, forming a crude stalk of legs, building themselves back into a humanoid form. Jamie hurtled the old furniture and wreckage like a pro football player, diving for the open window, shrugging off the sharp bite of the frame as it dragged across his ribs. He was on his bike and pedaling ferociously before he even realized he had made it outside, his heart burning and aching along with his lungs. His brain was threatening to destroy itself as he tried to process what he had just survived. It felt like a huge infected sore inside his skull. He focused on his math homework instead, mentally forming and solving equations that he otherwise hated. He'd tell his parents what happened, of course. He'd call the cops too, if they told him to. For now, however, he just needed to run and focus on the math. Nothing more, nothing less. Any other thoughts would invade him, would tear him to pieces, like the bugs had done to Gage. The wind ruffling his hair proved to be an effective camouflage for the tiny little passengers he'd brought with him. Clinging desperately to his sweat-dampened shirt until it was safe to roam again, they could seek out a warm, moist place to lay their eggs. This has been the Midnight Nexus. story written by B.D. Yates. Midnight Nexus created by Jacob Thornburg and Randal Woten. For more frightening tales, visit our Facebook page, The Midnight Nexus, or seek us out wherever podcasts can be found.